Hello and welcome to our community conversation, our second such conversation this summer. My name is Drew McIntyre. I'm the pastor at Grace United Methodist Church in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. We're glad to have you join us this evening. We have a very special guest with us tonight to talk about the intersection of faith and mental health, along with so many important but also difficult and anxiety-producing current events right now in our world. I'd like to welcome Reverend Dr. Gary Kling, who is with Chrysalis Counseling Center, here with us. Gary, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Drew. I appreciate the folks at Grace Church for letting me come on and talk a little bit about, as you say, the intersection between faith and mental health. Such an important subject right now, I believe, given all the challenges that we're experiencing right now. But I look for opportunities to do that, to come to churches, since I'm an ordained minister, to go to churches, to talk about mental health and faith. And sometimes we get into science and religion and medicine and faith and all of these things. So that's fine. I think the more we can debate, the more we can talk about this, that's always good for all parties.
Excellent. For those maybe watching this who are either new to our church or have never been to our church before, there's a long association between our church, Grace UMC, and Chrysalis Counseling. Gary's predecessor, friend, and mentor, Reverend Dr. Harry Long, helped start Chrysalis, and he was and his wife Jane is an active member of our congregation who's much beloved. So Gary's been with us on Sunday mornings before. He's preached for us before. We're grateful for his presence with us tonight. So Gary, we'll sort of go from more general to more particular this evening as we talk. And maybe first, for folks that are who don't know you, haven't met you before or heard your story, could you say a bit about your background as a pastor of local churches, and how you came to do mental health primarily as your ministry? How did you transition from one ministry to another?
Well, I think it all began back with my education. I am a child of the '60s, and so was raised during that period of time of Vietnam and racial unrest. And so I came through that period of time with probably many of the questions that young people have today, and looked to the church to be established, to get established. And it wasn't until I became connected with the Duke Divinity School and some of the folks there, and began my internships, so that I still felt the connection. I realized my calling into ministry came as a young person, but it wasn't a calling to something that was beyond question. It was something that was a spirit within that felt that I was called to, that God was calling me into this ministry. And it wasn't just a ministry of the church. When I got to Duke, I realized it was a ministry about people, and people who were having difficulty in their lives, particularly mental health issues. I did my internship at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. If anybody knows about St. Elizabeth's Hospital, it's a very chaotic type of sort of the early snake pit type hospital that one sees talked about in the movies sometimes. But by the time I was there at 1977, I felt drawn into this because many of the people who were having problems with mental health were also persons of great faith who really felt that they had started their journey much like I had, but at some point in time felt that God had either let them down or the church had let them down, or something had happened to them in their growth, and they became stunted or stopped that growth, and so reflected various issues that we as chaplains came on board to help with, and that really inspired me. And then coming back to Duke and feeling working at Duke Hospital led me even further into this interest in exploring God's ways with persons. And so it has been a continual interest of mine. It's not something that I left back years ago. Here I am getting into the golden years of life. I'm still fascinated by this, still interested in this, because this is something that now, even more so with the current crisis, the pandemic, and of racial justice, are still topics that I'm I'm still experiencing and trying to understand, as I think are other people too. Now, of course, this has been a relational journey. Um, Pastors were very instrumental in my life. I was raised a Baptist, but I met persons like Harold Strader, who was a pastor at First Church in Franklin, North Carolina, and had been through many of the difficulties of being a white pastor and having children in a multiracial relationship, multi-ethnic relationship, who was passionate about faith and passionate about preaching. And then I came across a fellow by the name of Carlisle Marney, who was a Baptist, who was also a very caring pastor. And then meeting Harry Long really helped me in 1980 and 82, encouraged me to go further in my studies. And so in 1982, I went back to Duke for an internship, and then fell into a depression of my own because of that. It was as if I was trying to work hard to get God's approval or to get people's approval, and I realized that that was part of my depression. And so entering therapy for the first time in my life was actually life-giving, life-saving. And I realized that by working with people in the church, through preaching and through liturgy and this kind of thing, I was also aware of other persons having problems who wanted to talk to a pastor who would listen. And that's what I say to people, that what Chrysalis is about, what Harry taught me, was not that this is about a talking cure. It's not so much a talking cure as it is a listening cure. It is the persons who find themselves unable to talk about or unable to be listened to seek out concerned therapists and counselors and ministers to talk to. And that hooked me. I was hooked for sure by talking to persons who were going through crises and these kinds of things with their marriage or with their partners or within themselves. That this was, and it was at that point that I realized this isn't just a mental health journey, it is a faith journey, and a desire to have faith in oneself, to be able to connect with a God who loves them and who cares for them. But how difficult it is for persons sometimes to make that, because of the trauma in their lives or because of some crisis that they've experienced or some relationship some grief and loss in their life, that they weren't able to make that journey by themselves. And so that's where we as counselors and therapists come in. So I like to think that we occupy a very special place. I joined AAPC, American Association of Pastoral Counselors, which was at the time made up of mostly ministers who were also doing psychotherapy and psychodynamic psychotherapy. And so I sort of fell in with them. And there it was not a sin to bring up God or faith or anything like that. It, in fact, you know, is welcome. So I guess that's why I picked up with them. Harry himself was with marriage and family therapy. He's been a state leader of that organization. And at one time I remember going to Harry and saying to him, Harry, shouldn't I go back to school and shouldn't I train to be a marriage and family therapist? He says, nah. He says, no, that's not important. He says, you've probably had more hours with couples and families than any marriage and family therapist I can think of. He says it would just be redundant for you to go back, and plus I would have had to go back and get a master's degree in order to walk that track. But so Harry really helped me sort of accept the gifts and graces that I had, and to be able to use those. He saw that, and I think he was really instrumental in helping me get connected with what was then Methodist Counseling Center. It was not Chrysalis at the time. It was started out, I think, as Pastoral Care Institute or something like that in 1978. It wasn't licensed until 1981, and I was still a pastor then, and my wife was doing her doctoral work in administration at UNCG, and that's what got me to back to Greensboro. It was my second time in Greensboro. First time was as associate pastor at Mears Chapel. The second time I came to Greensboro was as a pastor at Caraway Church, where I was for 6 years, all the time wanting to do this kind of work full time. And so that opportunity didn't come until 2002.
Gotcha. Thank you. Can you differentiate, Gary, for us, the difference in what you do, what Chrysalis does in pastoral counseling versus what I've heard referred to in different ways, Christian counseling or biblical counseling? Because I'm sure you have, I have as a pastor had sometimes to maybe sort of undo things. You know, people
Right.
paid money to someone that just threw up a shingle and got shamed or got, I would say, even spiritually harmed by folks that were not licensed to do this kind of work. Anyway, could you differentiate what you do with those?
Well, pastoral counseling, unfortunately, the name, people would say, oh, you mean you counsel pastors? I said, well, no, that's not it. It's counseling that emphasizes the kind of pastoral approach that Jesus emphasized. And we like to realize that is more holistic, more varietal, accepts people where they are, doesn't pass people through all kinds of hoops and everything before they can get care. It really comes out of that pastoral mentality. And I didn't think about it at the time, but people really have to know what a pastor really is. And unfortunately, we might not have a good idea of what pastors do these days. We see them as ministers and administrators and this kind of thing, but not pastors. But you're right. Some people go and they will seek, well, for instance, Christian counseling is a term we don't even use, primarily because the whole term Christian can just turn people off completely. So, you can see how terminology changes, can't you? It can affect people completely. So today it's probably more spiritually integrated counseling would be a way of putting it. But we clearly support and train alongside of and support mental health practitioners of across the board, because we see them as caring, as wanting to help people out of the crisis. But on the other hand, some mental health practitioners clearly feel that religion, faith, and these kinds of issues are just turnoffs, deal breakers when it comes to dealing with people who might be experiencing a filling of the Holy Spirit, for instance, or might be experiencing God in their life in some way. And these practitioners oftentimes don't take into consideration the importance of faith in helping a person get through their crisis and get healthy. So I guess we're sort of like borderline. We work in that border territory between mental health practitioners, licensed practitioners, and behavioral counselors, and this kind of thing, and other spiritual entities, the church.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Did that help any?
It did, yeah. That there are folks who do mental health care who are not as open to spiritual realities, not as open to understanding people of faith on their terms. But there are also folks that do something called counseling who may not have the necessary training or licensing on the mental health side. Whereas what you, Chrysalis, and other pastoral counselors do is professional mental health training that is open to people of faith backgrounds. And
right, bringing those two together.
Yeah,
yeah, bringing those two together.
Gary, I'm wondering, we've probably got people who will watch this, maybe who are interested in mental health, maybe who have considered maybe going to therapy at some point, but have just never taken that leap. They've got some fears or concerns. What do you think are some of the main barriers people have, or misconceptions people have about what you do, about mental health in general?
I think it's more along the lines of where I was when I first thought about therapy for myself. I thought it was basically, voodoo stuff, and and I had seen it. I had seen, therapists represented or psychologists and psychoanalysts represented in the movies so negatively, and I think that's where a lot of our church people, unfortunately, that's where they get their information from. Or I encounter a number of folks who had, parents who had their children were in crisis or something like that. And I'm going to take you to counselor. I'm going to take you into counseling. And, there's that kind of intimidation and threat. So they went in when they were 6 and 7 and 8 years old and had a horrific experience, and that really stuck with them, and they never really gave themselves a chance to open the door into helping themselves or helping their relationships. For me, it was an eye-opener. I mean, when I realized that all my problems probably weren't a result of my church people or my SPRC committee, it probably wasn't somebody else's fault, that maybe I had a part to play in that, was a real eye-opener. So I would just encourage folks who are on the fence about that to give it a try. And we want people to have, of course, a positive experience with therapy, but we also don't do therapy light. We we work with folks where they are, and some persons are going to come in and experience therapy and, oh, this is nice, but it's really not for me, and that's fine. Others will come in and take to it as I did, and feel it's really spirit led and spirit driven. We talk about healthy persons make healthy disciples, just as healthy leaders make healthy churches. And so, that's been my sort of take on this. Healthy persons, um, we develop tools that we'll use the rest of our life to heal from troubles and problems that we have throughout our lives. At least I am. I'm still using the tools that Harry and Don and others have given to me, and my numerous supervisors that I had in my training over the years. And I might mention also that I was very fortunate to have churches who understood that my training in therapy was going to benefit them, they were going to have a healthier pastor. And because they have a healthier pastor, they're going to have a healthier church. And it's going to be a church that they don't have to be embarrassed to invite their friends to, and that they can come and experience the healing that God has to share with them through that worship. But so I'm very fortunate in that way. I had churches who really allowed me to be away for training, for supervision, and I maintained about 6 to 8 hours during the week of people that I would see. Pretty much pro bono. There would be no charge because it was a ministry of the church and this kind of thing. A little bit different than what Chrysalis does now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, what you said about misconceptions about therapists is funny because as growing up, I guess, and before I ever did any kind of therapy myself, my main exposure to the idea of a therapist was the sitcom Frasier, and so I just expected that every single therapist was pretentious and went to Oxford and I don't know. I always loved Frasier.
Completely disconnected.
Yeah, totally. So socially incapable, all those things. Gary, I want to turn sort of to current events. We're recording this at the end of June in 2020. A lot of things going on in our world right now. There's been a pandemic that we keep hoping is almost over, but at least in some places, like where we are in North Carolina, numbers of people that are sick and dying continue to climb. We've also, following the death of George Floyd, seen a resurgence for calls for social change, for police reform, for systematic reform, and a lot of societal kind of anxiety and upheaval about the difference between the way things are and the way things should be. So not that you can answer all that, in one foul swoop, but I guess as a therapist,
good. I'm glad you didn't want.
What's the one answer to all this, Gary?
The one answer.
So maybe we'll start sort of with the pandemic and the lockdown. What have you seen in terms of how this is affecting, mental health, and what, as we still don't know how, if this is going to be over in a year or what, whenever maybe a vaccine is, maybe what have you seen it cause in people, and what's some advice for resiliency in the face of this kind of uncertainty?
We're seeing more and more persons come through the doors who are suffering from anxiety because of the pandemic. I used to think that if you were an introvert, this was like better than sliced bread. I get to stay inside and read all the books I haven't read and see all the movies that I haven't seen, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a relational component to this. I mean, it affects my relationships with my children, with my spouse. And so we're seeing more and more persons who are who are coming through the doors who are experiencing this. We're doing more telehealth to people who are quite intimidated to get out. We will have to deal with that as we move forward. But for right now, it's how can I what do I do, particularly if I have children who now I'm finding are at home and I'm schooling. I'm having to be their teacher now. It just really has shifted the whole basis on which the family is arranged, and employment too. Employment that used to be um, at the office 9 to 5 we used to talk about is now employment that can be done at home, and not 5 days a week even, but maybe just 2 or 3 days a week. So yes, we are starting to see more and more persons who are experiencing particularly anxiety and some anxious depression. And this affects the brain and can re-traumatize persons who have had adverse childhood experiences or true bodily trauma, because that can affect these persons who perhaps with PTSD and others who see now proof that the world is a dangerous place, and it sort of confirms that they are in a lockdown mode. So I guess there's a positive part to that, and that is that more persons are taking this as an occasion to reach out to therapists. And I think you'll see on YouTube and others, there's more talk about what to do in these kind of cases. Where I'm finding myself going increasingly is with mindfulness training. And mindfulness is not just a trendy thing. It's mindfulness now is a way in which I can deal with the numerous negative thoughts that I'm having that maybe keep me up at night, keep me from getting restful sleep, or get in the way of my having healthy relationships with my spouse or partner. So mindfulness training is something that we're working on to train our counselors in this, how to help persons to stay focused and centered on themselves through the use of their breath. I've been accused of pushing this off as meditation. I said, I'm not teaching meditation, but we have to keep in mind that maybe Jesus was a Near Eastern person and so knew something about meditation and the value of retreat and prayer, this kind of thing. And maybe we need to rediscover that, the advantages for us in our very busy time.
He certainly, did in the Gospels. We see Jesus going off by himself to a quiet place. Even
right.
There's crowds of people that want his attention. He'll just, leave the disciples to it. Hey, give him a fish sandwich. I'm gonna go do my thing for a little bit. We certainly do see that in the Gospels. For Gary, for folks maybe that mindfulness is a new term or new concept, could you give just a quick definition of mindfulness if people want to go find more information about that?
Okay. Mindfulness is a practice of focusing on one's breath, and through the process of breathing, learning how to breathe deeply from deep within, as opposed to shallow breathing, which takes place in the upper chest. They can actually affect their body. They can bring down their blood pressure. This is probably the best thing, is that this is so evidence-based. It's been researched out the wazoo. We really feel on solid ground when we talk to people about training people about just focusing on the here and now, and through the breath, emptying out the negativity, refocusing on the breath, just as God created Adam and Eve through the breath. The breath, the nefed, has always been an important part in the Bible and in our lives now. So it's refocusing, it's disconnecting for just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes during the day to focus on oneself and to reestablish and reconnect with one's inner moral and ethical thinking. And it can really have positive effects throughout one's life too. Now there's some dangers to this, of course. For instance, persons who've been traumatized deeply, for them to go into this kind of thing is very frightful and fearful and might need the help of a therapist. But for the most part, persons who do mindfulness breathing can do this on their own and can help themselves. And it deals with a lot of the discordant emotions that we feel, especially in this day and time. I think also staying focused is important. This mindfulness is important training that can be helpful to police forces, government officials. We can certainly teach our children how to be more focused and how to trust their own thoughts and their way of thinking. It's a very detailed process, but once persons begin this process, it becomes habitual. They'll find that there's not just brain benefits, but there's also bodily benefits to this, and so it really is life-giving.
Thank you.
I hope that's at least. It's hard to sum up a complete idea of what mindfulness is. I would point folks to I think his name is Howard Kabat-Zinn, is a good Thich Nhat Hanh is a good person to access about. In fact, Thich Nhat Hanh was also instrumental in helping being a part of Martin Luther King's campaign for nonviolence back in the 60s. That's how he got sort of named. But I've done this in the hospital setting. People have really had, at first they have questions about it, but eventually when I encourage them to try it and they try it, they come back and say, wow, this has really been helpful. Do mindfulness.
That's good to know. Thank you. Gary, I wonder, maybe this is a bridge to talking about other current issues around racial injustice and social change. We're seeing, I think, both with the pandemic and also with questions about social change, racial injustice, this vastly polarized response. That, you know, it's so strange to me that particularly things like wearing masks has fallen along ideological or political lines, and similar, you know, how you even view something like the death of George Floyd or the, you know, instances of police brutality, that it seems to fall along oddly clean political lines. And I don't want to talk politics, but there's got to be a mental health component to that. How do you, as a mental health person, you know, view some of those dynamics? How do we get a 10,000 foot view of this from is there a way to have an outside perspective on these things, or something that is not, it just seems, I'm concerned that it's dangerous that we tend to read things so much based on our own worldview. And I'm not sure how to get out of that. Do you have any ideas about that? That's a huge question.
I mean, how to get out of your own head? And
yes. Other than mindfulness. Mindfulness sounds like a good start.
Yeah, how to get out of your head and embrace God's creation, in which he might have or she might have put people in it that you don't particularly like, or who have different political views than you do. Sure, I like to think of it as that kind of variety, but not everybody is inclined to embrace that kind of variety. I think a lot of it comes from, in order for me to grow as a person, this thought, for me to grow as a person, I need to have some kind of an enemy, or I need to have some kind of a foe in order to push back on, in order to define myself, you know. And oftentimes that is just so, I mean, it's so childish, because it leaves me a victim, and it means this other person's the oppressor. And so it's sort of a split. And now, I'm not comfortable with being a victim, but evidently some folks are. Uh, if there's really nothing, it's not to use a modern term, it's non-sustainable. It's not a sustainable approach to life, to find enemies to continue that process. Now, sometimes that helps me to define what is important to me, but then why can't I explore with another person, for instance, a multi-ethnic or a multiracial group? What are your values like? And are your values like my values? Or are we in this together as human beings, or are we just in this as racial and ethnic entities? Our group, our club, for instance. Just like I experienced some churches have their own club, and some churches who can have we call it silo type thinking, Well, I think what's happening with the changes that are going on in society right now is it's helping us to break out of these silos. It's helping us to see that there's a much bigger world out there. It's kind of like when I went off into the Air Force for the first time. I was in my Christian bubble, and then I went into the Air Force, and boy, did it ever break me out of that bubble. It was painful. It certainly wasn't. It wasn't something that I enjoyed. But nonetheless, I guess I could have put myself back in a smaller type bubble, but that wasn't where I felt God calling me. And I don't think that's where God is calling us. I think God is calling us through the unrest that we're experiencing to a wider vision of human beings together, to a society that maybe this is the next step in terms of understanding each other, not as the color of our skin, or like Martin Luther King said, but by the character, by our character through our moral behavior with one another and how we value one another. So we've got a lot to learn, but you're right, it's very painful. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're experiencing right now. The church can be a wonderful place to find that togetherness too. I just wanted to throw that in because I know you're a minister. So
Yeah, and we're certainly like many other congregations, I think right now, searching for ways to, be a part of a solution, or be in conversation about racial injustice and what it means to be the church that
sure.
That resists those impulses in our society. You mentioned earlier that as you approach therapy, it is a listening healing, not a talking healing. And what occurs to me is that so much of what we're seeing right now in the news is people expressing in different ways that they've not been heard. They've not been listened to. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, and just a little lesson about that. You know how difficult it is. Like, I just cut you off right there. How difficult it is when somebody is saying something that you may not want to hear, and you're there, you're ready to throw out something. It's not that you heard that person, truly heard them, and can say back to them what you just heard them say, and talk about that. It's that through the very process of jumping back in and countering what they had to say, you're not hearing them. So it's hard. It's hard to do. But we've got to learn better ways of listening, um, so we can learn better ways of doing.
Yeah, I saw someone comments on social media that maybe being locked in our houses and only communicating over Facebook and Twitter hasn't been good for us as a society, because of course those are ways, so much for social media is we can express, but it's really not great platforms for listening, and it becomes, as you know, a lot of mudslinging and vitriol and
Definitely.
spewing. We've got a few minutes left here, and I want to give folks time to ask some questions. I know
Sure.
other folks probably want to chime in. So we have a few other folks with us, and just a time for questions for Gary about anything that he's talked about, or maybe things he hasn't brought up that you're curious about related to current events or mental health or the intersection of mental health and faith. So does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask Gary?
Oh, come on, let's jump in there.
I'll throw one out as others are thinking. Are there, particular, if someone's watching this and they're a reader and interested in some of these topics? You mentioned a couple names related to mindfulness, but are there other authors that you'd recommend digging into, maybe around faith and mental health or anything like this?
Well, you are aware of my prejudice towards Pete Scazzero. Um, I don't know that there's too much there that I don't like about Pete Scazzero, because when I came on board at the counseling center with Harry, when I started reading and listening to Pete Scazzero and the New Life Church up in Queens, New York, he just seemed to pull together these two elements that we've been talking about, this whole element of faith and the value and the importance of faith, and of psychological growth. And boy, that's somebody I really I just don't think you can get enough of. He has some coursework on discipleship making, and he's been down to Myers Park and Charlotte, and I think that would be a good person to listen to. Right now, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. I'm reading Carl Jung. I'm reading W.R.D. Fairbairn. I'm reading Gun Trip, and others. A lot in the history of science and counseling and faith. So it's a pretty broad swath. But is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I would second Scazzero. As you know, I'm also a big fan. You've read him more than I have, but
Sure.
Emotionally Healthy Church, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. He's got courses you can take. He does conferences. He's got a really impressive way of integrating faith and mental health, and really, really deep theology, as well as kind of the best of mental health and emotional life. It's really good stuff, and incorporates ancient practices, I think, in really
Yeah.
profound ways. Really, really good stuff.
Probably not real popular with the mass media, culture, but definitely I think a benefit to any pastors. And that's one of the things I want to say thank you to Grace Church for their contributions to Chrysalis and to Methodist Counseling for us to be able to do some of the training that we do. As soon as we can meet up again, I think we'll get back to doing some of our lunch and learns. But we are continuing to keep the Samaritan Client Assistance Program alive, and that helps people who are of late who are not able to, who don't have jobs, to be able to get counseling for very little money. Persons who don't have insurance to be able to get, and it's just such a big boon to help people that I wish more churches knew about the importance of supporting this kind of ministry. Um,
Well, we're grateful for your presence for this conversation. Hopefully, getting this out will make more people here, especially locally, aware of what you do. I've got one final kind of wrap up question. If there are no other questions from other people that are on the call,
okay.
I was going to mention, Gary, one thing that I'm seeing, as a leader at work and also with family and friends is a real need for resilience. And you mentioned that earlier in your, I didn't really go too much into it, but people are impatient, both with the pandemic, which, who knows how long that's going to last, but it's probably going to be a lot longer than we want. And also the racial issues, when are they going to be fixed, and trying to live your daily life with this impatience and with this, kind of lack of resilience. You have any about that? Can you fix that?
Yeah. Well, it's like the couple who comes in and she or he wants their spouse fixed, isn't it? I mean, and it's hard to turn that down. But they don't want them fixed through normal channels of working through the process of therapy. They want them fixed within like 3 sessions, or 4 sessions. So that impatience, I generally tell folks that impatience is something that can actually undermine your best instincts. There's nothing wrong with wanting that healing to happen, but it's like you say, it's the impatience sometimes that we bring to that can actually undermine the very thing that we want. But resilience, yes, is a big one, and it's really being studied, isn't it? I mean, resilience is being studied broadly now. What kind of tools and skills help persons as opposed to those that undermine people's natural ability. I sort of like to think of, well, the church often comes out of the process of that we're all broken, and we're broken in this way, and it's called sin. Psychology can come out of the side that says, well, it's just a matter of discovering a few things that will help you, and then you're back to normal. Well, you've heard a lot of terms in the new normal. It's like we don't know what normal is anymore, and we're still trying to get there. So that can be really at cross purposes sometimes. But yes, resilience is important. Particularly if you, Lynn, you work with nursing staff and this kind of thing. Do you see a number of persons coming in? This is a health caring field. Do you see a number of persons coming into that field that are, relatively healthy in the way in which they want to administer care and this kind of thing? How do you see that? I don't want to put you on the spot, but
I'm just not sure what you're asking. So are the people pursuing nursing, are they healthy themselves, like mental?
Yeah, I guess. Are you seeing tools, the resiliency in some of these persons who are coming into healthcare?
Some. Some of the students are just young and they're immature, so they're having to develop that. And then some of the faculty that I work with just, have a lot on them, different influences their life, their, families, and it's just seeming to be just too much, trying to deal with how to do the job with all this extra, stuff, and how how to be healthy in the long term, because we know it's going to be a long term.
Yeah. We could have too much stuff on us, for instance. Yeah. Yeah.
I recently read a really good book called Grit. I think the author is Angela Duckworth, and there's a lot in there about the psychology of resilience and how to encourage resilience, particularly with in parenting, but it would also apply elsewhere. So there's some really interesting work on resilience in there. But that right now, that does seem to be a really necessary topic for all that's going on. Yeah, that's an important thing. But what I want to close with, Gary, as we are at time, is and we'll put contact information like the website for Chrysalis in the description of this video, so when people watch this on YouTube, they can get to the Chrysalis website. But if folks want to connect, folks locally want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that? But also people are watching this who are not local to the Triad, but maybe want to connect with a pastoral counselor. How would you recommend someone finding someone like you in a different area?
Well, probably the best thing is to contact myself through my email address. And I'd be delighted to talk with anybody who has an interest in this and exploring this further, for sure. They can go to our website, which is chrysaliscenters.org, chrysaliscenters.org. Yeah, I'm sort of in my role as executive director at Chrysalis. I'm sort of the clearinghouse for persons who may want to find other counselors and other therapists in the area. We keep a pretty rich database of folks who work in the same way in which we work, who have the same professional licensure and confidential emphasis that we have. So yeah, they can just get in touch with me.
Great. We'll put that information in the show description here for YouTube. We are at our hour, Gary. We appreciate your time and also your ministry.
Thank you.
What you do in our community. We appreciate that so much, and your time. And we pray that this conversation would bear fruit in the lives of our community here in Greensboro and the Triad, and also for anyone that watches this. They'll be encouraged to seek out mental health and to grow in mindfulness and all the things that we've been talking about. So thank you so much for your time this evening, and for all those that are watching and asking questions and participating.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. And for Grace, folks, Gary and I had planned to do a faith and mental health sermon series, kind of a conversational series that was supposed to happen, supposed to have already happened by now. But we bumped that with everything that happened with the pandemic. So hopefully that's something we can do in the next year or so. We'll circle
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. We'll circle back to that. This is sort of a little preview of what that might look like. So, so Gary, thank you. Thanks to those watching. God
blessings
bless you.
On you. Blessings on the folks there, and Grace Church.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Take care.